5 American conflicts. 5 fortunes amassed from each single one, not through market guesswork, but through government agreements. Allow me to illuminate the blueprint that has elevated certain dynasties to untold wealth while countless lives were lost. There exists a business strategy woven into American history, one that yields greater returns than petroleum, maintains more stability than financial institutions, and enjoys more protection than any private enterprise. This model has enriched the same lineages for 6 generations, forging empires that command billions in assets, underwrite political campaigns, fund university endowments, and establish philanthropic organizations. Its foundation rests on a straightforward principle: profit from every war, any war, all wars. Because while soldiers perish and citizens bear the financial burden, a select consortium of corporations invariably triumphs. The agreements are publicly accessible, the earnings are meticulously documented, and the recurring pattern is irrefutable. The DuPont lineage, purveyors of explosives and chemicals, from the Revolutionary War through the Iraq War, a span of 220 years of war profiteering. The Rockefellers, masters of oil and fuel, from the Civil War to Afghanistan, 160 years of energy dominance during wartime. The Morgan banking dynasty, architects of war finance, from the Spanish-American War to the Second World War, providing capital to governments and profiting from every side. The predecessors of Lockheed Martin, specialists in aviation and weaponry, from the First World War to the present day, over a century of defense procurement, and Halliburton, providers of military logistics and infrastructure, from the Second World War through the War on Terror, 80 years of sole source contracts and inflated expenditures, 5 dynasties, 5 enterprises, and if you trace their financial gains across American wars, the same narrative unfolds. Hostilities are declared, stock values ascend, agreements are finalized, earnings skyrocket, the conflict concludes, they retain the capital, and by the time the next war erupts, they are fully prepared. This preparedness stems not merely from profiting from conflict, but from actively fostering the conditions that rendered war unavoidable through influence peddling, political contributions, and the shaping of international policy. This is not conjecture, it is capitalism applied to armed struggle, and the proof is publicly available. Observe, war by war, contract by contract, dollar by dollar. Let us commence with the family that quite literally established the American military-industrial complex, the DuPonts. While their name might evoke associations with chemicals or Teflon, the DuPont wealth was fundamentally built upon gunpowder, and they have been the suppliers of explosives for every American military engagement since 1802. Consider first how they strategically positioned themselves. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont arrived in America from France in 1800. He possessed training as a chemist and had experience in French gunpowder facilities, recognizing a significant opportunity. America, having recently concluded a revolution and embarked on westward expansion, faced a perpetual demand for explosives for land reclamation, resource extraction, and warfare. In 1802, he founded the DuPont Company along the banks of the Brandywine River in Delaware. This locale was strategically chosen for its proximity to Philadelphia and Washington, its access to water for powering mills, and its sufficient distance from populated areas to mitigate the repercussions of explosions. By the War of 1812, DuPont was already furnishing gunpowder to the United States military. This marked their inaugural substantial government contract, setting a precedent that would endure for 2 centuries. A war commences. The government requires explosives. DuPont is prepared with existing manufacturing capabilities. They secure the contract. Production capacity expands. Substantial profits are realized. The war concludes. They retain the infrastructure awaiting the next engagement. The Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, saw DuPont supplying gunpowder for both artillery and small arms. The contract's value exceeded $1 million, equivalent to approximately $35 million in contemporary currency. However, the more significant gain was cementing DuPont's status as the government's preferred vendor. When a company has demonstrated its reliability during a prior conflict, it naturally gains priority for subsequent ones. The Civil War, spanning from 1861 to 1865, represented a pivotal moment for DuPont. The Union Army's demand for gunpowder reached unprecedented levels, driven by 4 years of relentless combat, countless skirmishes, and millions of rounds expended. DuPont's facilities operated around the clock, producing over 4 million pounds of gunpowder. The contracts commanded over $10 million, translating to more than $300 million today, and this figure represents only direct sales. DuPont also supplied private entities who, in turn, resold to the government at a markup. This is where the situation becomes particularly intriguing. The DuPont family members were aligned with the Northern Democrats. They were opposed to abolition, and some even offered political support to the Confederacy. Nevertheless, they supplied gunpowder to the Union because that is where the government contracts were. Ideology took a back seat to profit, and following the war, with the Union victorious, DuPont was recognized as a patriotic enterprise that had contributed to saving the nation. The nuanced reality of their position faded, leaving only the financial gains. The First World War, from 1914 to 1918, transformed DuPont from a significant corporation into a veritable dynasty. Prior to America's entry into the conflict in 1917, DuPont supplied explosives to Great Britain and France, including millions of pounds of gunpowder, TNT, and smokeless powder. Upon the United States joining the war, DuPont's production capacity surged dramatically. They erected new manufacturing facilities, engaged thousands of workers, and provided 40% of all explosives utilized by the Allied forces. The profits were immense. DuPont's net earnings climbed from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918, an amount exceeding $1 billion today. In a mere 4 years, their profits escalated by 1,600%. Crucially, after the war concluded, they did not divest these earnings. Instead, they diversified into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials, leveraging war profits to construct a civilian empire. Yet their military supply operations did not cease. The Second World War ushered in another period of accelerated growth. DuPont supplied explosives, nylon for parachutes, and was involved in the Manhattan Project, operating the plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington. This contract operated on a cost-plus basis, guaranteeing payment for all expenses plus a predetermined profit margin, effectively eliminating any financial risk for the company. The government assumed all liabilities: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq. Each ensuing conflict saw DuPont or its successor entities providing essential materials. By the early 2000s, DuPont's defense division had been spun off and integrated into other corporations, yet the family's wealth persisted. The DuPont Family Trust is currently valued at an estimated $30 billion, with descendants 6 generations removed from Eleuthère continuing to benefit from gunpowder profits. Now, let us turn our attention to the Rockefellers, synonymous with oil, the indispensable resource for every modern military, and the family that maintained a near-century-long monopoly over it. John D. Rockefeller established Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This was not merely a business, it was an absolute monopoly. And when America engaged in warfare, this monopoly transformed into a strategic imperative. The Spanish-American War in 1898, though brief, held significant implications. The United States Navy had begun transitioning from coal-powered vessels to oil-fired ships in the 1890s, rendering Standard Oil indispensable. Naval units required fuel oil. The war lasted only a few months, but it firmly established oil's crucial role in military operations. Rockefeller supplied the fuel for the fleet and derived a valuable lesson: control the fuel, and you control the military. The First World War marked the inaugural industrialized conflict, where oil played a decisive role. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ships all depended on petroleum products, and Standard Oil, despite its dissolution into separate entities by antitrust legislation in 1911, continued to exert dominance through its successor companies, Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, all under Rockefeller control. They supplied fuel to the U.S. military and the Allied nations, with contracts valued in the hundreds of millions. However, the Rockefeller strategy diverged from DuPont's in a critical aspect. They did not limit their sales to a single belligerent. Standard Oil's German subsidiary provided fuel to Germany. Even after America's entry into the war, Rockefeller-affiliated companies engaged in trade with Germany through neutral countries. This was not considered treason. It was simply sound business practice, legally permissible as the companies were technically distinct entities. The profits generated from both sides of the First World War propelled the Rockefellers to become the wealthiest family in America. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire, and the family expanded its ventures into banking, real estate, and philanthropy, with oil remaining their fundamental enterprise. The Second World War mirrored this pattern. Rockefeller-affiliated companies supplied fuel to the U.S. military through exclusive cost-plus contracts that guaranteed profits. Standard Oil of New Jersey, a predecessor to Exxon, faced scrutiny for its dealings with Nazi Germany via its subsidiaries. Investigations revealed that Standard Oil had shared patents for synthetic rubber with the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben, even after the commencement of hostilities, thereby providing Germany with technology that prolonged the war. Senator Harry Truman, prior to his presidency, led this investigation. His committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had detrimentally impacted the war effort. However, no prosecutions ensued, as the company's indispensability to the military's fuel supply superseded any legal action. Consequently, the investigation was quietly shelved and the contracts proceeded. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Every conflict necessitated oil. And Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, the Rockefeller successor companies, fulfilled this demand. The profits were so substantial that by the 1970s, the Rockefeller family began divesting from oil holdings to preempt public scrutiny, though their immense wealth remained. The estimated net worth of the Rockefeller family today stands at $11 billion, amassed through the sale of oil to armies that consumed it during wartime. Next, we examine the Morgan banking dynasty and their role in war financing. Wars require not only armaments and fuel, but also substantial capital. Those who provide this capital stand to profit, regardless of the ultimate victor. J.P. Morgan established his banking empire in the 1870s. By 1900, J.P. Morgan and Company had become the most influential bank in America. Morgan understood a fundamental truth that would define a century of war profits. Governments engaged in conflict will borrow at any conceivable rate, as the alternative is defeat. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was partially financed through Morgan's loans to the U.S. government. While this was a minor conflict with relatively small loans, it solidified the crucial relationship. The government developed trust in Morgan, and Morgan profited from the accrued interest. The First World War presented a different scenario. When hostilities erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States maintained official neutrality. However, American banks, spearheaded by J.P. Morgan, extended loans to Britain and France, totaling over $2 billion between 1914 and 1917, a sum equivalent to over $50 billion today. These loans were instrumental in the procurement of weaponry, provisions, and supplies, a significant portion of which originated from American companies. Thus, American banks loaned capital to allied nations, who then utilized these funds to purchase goods from American manufacturers, creating a circulation of money where profits accumulated on both ends. Here lies a critical aspect. These loans rendered American neutrality untenable. By 1917, Britain and France owed such substantial sums to American banks that their defeat would have precipitated a financial catastrophe within the United States. Non-repayment would have led to the collapse of American banks and a widespread economic downturn. Therefore, when President Wilson requested congressional authorization for a declaration of war in April 1917, the motivations extended beyond abstract ideals of democracy or addressing German aggression. They were fundamentally about safeguarding American financial interests. Senator George Norris of Nebraska articulated this sentiment explicitly during the debate on war declaration, stating, "We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." Despite his dissenting vote, Congress ultimately approved the declaration of war, and J.P. Morgan's loans were effectively underwritten by the might of the American military. Following the war, Morgan profited once more. Germany owed reparations to the Allied powers, and the Allies in turn owed money to the United States. Morgan orchestrated the loans that enabled Germany to pay reparations, which the Allies then used to repay their American creditors. Morgan collected substantial fees at each stage. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, facilitated the refinancing of billions in war debts, with Morgan earning millions in fees. The Second World War followed a similar trajectory. Prior to America's involvement, Morgan banks financed British war-related purchases. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government incurred significant debt to fund the war effort. Morgan banks underwrote war bonds and treasury securities, collecting fees on every issuance. Post-war, Morgan banks played a role in financing reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan, aimed at rebuilding Europe, was partly administered through institutions with ties to Morgan. The Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, every conflict demanded financial backing. and Morgan banks, by then consolidated into J.P. Morgan Chase, were consistently involved, underwriting government debt, financing defense contractors, and profiting from interest and fees. While the Morgan family no longer directs the day-to-day operations of the bank, their wealth endures. The family fortune is estimated at $30 billion, accumulated through lending funds for wars and collecting interest while soldiers perished, bearing the ultimate cost. Now, let us consider Lockheed Martin, or more precisely, the amalgamation of companies that formed Lockheed Martin, as military aviation has proven lucrative since the First World War. The Lougheed brothers, later stylized as Lockheed, established their aircraft company in 1912. By the First World War, they were producing aircraft for the military, albeit on a small scale with experimental designs. However, aviation represented the future, and early entrants into this sector positioned themselves for a century of sustained profitability. The First World War saw limited aerial engagement, primarily for reconnaissance and some bombing, yet the potential was evident. Following the war, military aviation contracts dwindled, leading to the bankruptcy of many aircraft manufacturers. Lockheed survived by producing civilian aircraft, while diligently maintaining its connections within the military sphere. The Second World War was their watershed moment. Aircraft became pivotal. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes were all essential. Lockheed manufactured the P-38 Lightning fighter, with over 10,000 units produced, and the Hudson bomber, with over 2,800 units manufactured. The contracts were valued in the hundreds of millions. However, Lockheed's true innovation lay in something beyond just building aircraft. They cultivated robust relationships within the Pentagon. They recruited former military officers for executive positions and strategically located factories within congressional districts where representatives were eager to secure employment for their constituents, rendering the company politically insulated. Post-Second World War, the Cold War sustained a continuous flow of contracts. Lockheed developed the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the C-130 cargo plane, which remains in service today. Each decade brought new procurement opportunities, and Lockheed's strategy remained consistent. Deliver adequate products, underestimate projected costs, secure the contract, and subsequently seek additional funding by citing unforeseen project complexities. The Pentagon invariably acquiesced, as canceling a project would necessitate admitting financial mismanagement. The C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft serves as a prime illustration. The initial contract in 1965 was for $2.1 billion. By the time of delivery, the actual expenditure had reached $5.3 billion, a staggering 150% overrun. Did Lockheed incur financial losses? No. Under a cost-plus contract, they received reimbursement for all expenses, plus a profit margin. The Pentagon could not abandon the project, having already invested billions. Therefore, they paid, Lockheed profited, and Congress approved the expenditure, given the factory's employment of thousands in Georgia, a politically significant state. Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Each conflict generated Lockheed contracts. By the 1990s, the defense industry was undergoing consolidation. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in 1995, forming Lockheed Martin. Today, it stands as the world's largest defense contractor, with revenues of $65 billion in 2023, 90% of which is derived from government contracts. The pattern persists. The F-35 fighter jet, the most expensive weapons program in history, initially budgeted at $233 billion, now carries an estimated cost exceeding $1.7 trillion. That is trillion with a T. This represents a sevenfold increase over the original projection, and Lockheed continues to be compensated, with the Pentagon covering every cost overrun due to the impossibility of cancellation, given the immense investment, the number of jobs at stake, and the reliance of numerous congressional districts on the program. While the Lockheed family no longer directly controls the company, which is now publicly traded, its shareholders reap the benefits, and the pattern established over a century ago endures. A war is declared. Lockheed's stock value rises, contracts are awarded, costs escalate, the government disperses funds, shareholders profit, and the cycle repeats. Now consider Halliburton, a company that elevated military logistics to an art form. Halliburton was founded in 1919 by Earl P. Halliburton. Initially operating as an oil field service company specializing in well cementing, the founder recognized the lucrative potential of infrastructure development, whether for the oil industry or the military. By the Second World War, Halliburton was engaged in constructing bases, airfields, and ports for the military. The operational model was straightforward. The military required rapid infrastructure development. Halliburton possessed the requisite expertise and equipment. They were awarded sole-source contracts, bypassing competitive bidding due to time constraints. Upon completion of the facilities, cost-plus contracts ensured reimbursement for all expenses, plus a guaranteed profit, thereby eliminating financial risk. The Korean War saw Halliburton constructing bases and infrastructure. Vietnam represented a more extensive undertaking. Through its subsidiary, Brown & Root, Halliburton built roads, ports, and airfields across South Vietnam. The contracts, valued in the billions, were awarded without competitive bidding, facilitated by Brown & Root's political connections. This is where political influence becomes paramount. George R. Brown, founder of Brown & Root, was a significant contributor to Lyndon B. Johnson's political campaigns. Johnson's political ascent was in part funded by Brown. Upon Johnson's ascension to the presidency, Brown & Root secured substantial contracts for Vietnam-related infrastructure projects. Was this mere coincidence? Perhaps, but the pattern is undeniable. Political donations, access to power, government contracts, and subsequent profit. The Gulf War in 1991 marked Halliburton's return. Dick Cheney served as Secretary of Defense. Halliburton was awarded contracts for constructing facilities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Following the war, Cheney departed government service and assumed the role of CEO of Halliburton in 1995, holding this position until 2000 when he became vice president under George W. Bush. Then came the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, secured contracts exceeding $40 billion. These were sole-source agreements with cost-plus pricing. Halliburton constructed bases, provided catering services, supplied fuel, and managed logistical operations, all at astronomical costs. The Pentagon's Inspector General identified billions in waste and overcharges. Halliburton billed the government for meals that were never served, for fuel deliveries that never materialized, and for construction work that remained incomplete. When questioned, Halliburton contended that the chaotic nature of war zones inherently involved some level of waste, a contention the government accepted, continuing to provide payment, while Vice President Dick Cheney recused himself from contract decisions involving Halliburton. However, his former company received more contracts during his tenure than in any preceding period. From 2003 to 2008, Halliburton's government contracts increased by 400%, and its stock price tripled. Upon leaving office in 2009, Cheney still held Halliburton stock options valued in the millions. This encapsulates the prevailing pattern. Corporations hire former politicians as executives. These executives cultivate relationships within the government. When conflicts arise, these connections translate into lucrative contracts, with profits subsequently shared. Politicians retire with substantial wealth. Companies experience increased prosperity, and taxpayers bear the financial burden. Now, let us examine the unified strategy across all 5 entities, as their profitability from war was not merely a consequence, but a meticulously executed plan, a methodology repeated for 150 years. Stage 1. Pre-war positioning. All 5 corporations established their indispensability prior to the commencement of hostilities. DuPont developed its explosive manufacturing capacity during peacetime. Rockefeller established a monopoly in oil refining. Morgan cultivated banking relationships. Lockheed maintained military contracts between conflicts. Halliburton developed its expertise in infrastructure provision. When war erupted, they were ready, unlike their competitors. Stage 2. Securing the initial contract. Governments require immediate supplies. There is insufficient time for competitive bidding. The pre-positioned companies are awarded sole-source contracts justified under the guise of national security. We cannot wait for bids, we need it now. Once the initial contract is secured, subsequent agreements become considerably easier, as they are recognized as the proven supplier. Stage 3. Cost-plus pricing. Nearly every major war contract since the Civil War has utilized cost-plus pricing. The contractor bills the government for all expenses incurred, plus a guaranteed percentage of profit. This effectively eliminates all financial risk. If costs exceed projections, the government assumes the additional burden. If the project extends beyond its expected timeline, the contractor realizes increased profits. The objective is to inflate expenses, not reduce them. Step 4. Exceed financial limits. Every significant military hardware program over the past 50 years has gone over its allocated budget. The F-35 program ran over 7 times its initial estimate, the Zumwalt-class destroyer 3 times over. the literal combat ship, twice its original projection. This isn't a matter of incompetence, it's the established operational strategy. They secure the contract with an underestimated bid, then subsequently inflate the projected costs. The government finds itself unable to cancel the projects because substantial investments have already been made. Consequently, they pay, and the contractor benefits from the escalating expenses. Step 5. Co-opt regulatory bodies. When military personnel retire, where do they typically find employment? With defense corporations. Generals who authorize contracts for companies like Lockheed Martin often transition to executive positions within those same companies. Admirals who supervise naval shipbuilding join maritime construction firms. The continuous movement of individuals between the Pentagon and the defense industry is so deeply ingrained that it has a recognized designation, ensuring that those awarding contracts maintain connections that will serve their interests later. Step 6. Advocate for increased conflict. This is the most disturbing element. Defense contractors allocate considerable sums to influence lawmakers in Congress. They contribute to political campaigns. They finance policy research organizations that publish reports advocating for military intervention. The Center for Strategic and International Studies and the American Enterprise Institute, both recipients of funding from defense contractors, have consistently produced research supporting military action. During the debates surrounding the invasion of Iraq in 2002, defense contractors funded entities that generated intelligence assessments endorsing the intervention. They financed advertising campaigns. They engaged former generals to appear on news programs, promoting the rationale for war. And upon the authorization of hostilities, these same contractors secured billions in new agreements. Did they instigate the Iraq War? No. But they cultivated an environment conducive to conflict and profited when it occurred. Step 7. Diversify the gains. The profits generated from warfare are not confined to armaments. DuPont utilized its earnings from explosives manufacturing to establish a chemical conglomerate. Rockefeller leveraged its oil revenues to acquire financial institutions and real estate holdings. Morgan's financial empire was built on interest and fees from war financing, which was then used to fund peacetime industries. These corporations diversify their operations so that their accumulated wealth persists even after conflicts conclude. Consequently, the families behind these enterprises ascend to dynastic status, amassing generational fortunes through the benefits of war. Now, allow me to illustrate the magnitude of this. What level of profit are we contemplating? DuPont's total earnings from military contracts since 1802 are conservatively estimated at over $50 billion, adjusted for inflation. Companies affiliated with Rockefeller have amassed over $100 billion from fuel sales to the military since 1898. The interest and fees generated by Morgan banks from financing wartime efforts are estimated at over $75 billion. Lockheed Martin and its predecessor entities have received over $200 billion for aircraft and associated systems since 1917. Halliburton has earned over $60 billion for logistical support and infrastructure projects since 1942. Collectively, these 5 corporations and their antecedents have extracted in excess of $485 billion from American taxpayers through wartime contracts. This figure represents documented, publicly accessible contract values. It does not encompass indirect profits, increases in stock valuations, real estate acquired with war earnings, or entire industries established with wartime capital. If those elements were included, the total would exceed $1 trillion. And here is the crucial detail. This revenue originated from taxpayers. Every dollar paid to DuPont for munitions was derived from American workers through taxation. Every dollar dispersed to Halliburton for logistical services was financed through deficit spending, which future generations will be obligated to repay. These are not standard commercial profits. They represent public funds redirected into private hands, justified by the pretext of war. Now, the pertinent question you should be asking is this practice still ongoing? Yes. Presently, allow me to present the current figures. In 2023, the United States military expenditure was $816 billion. The 5 largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, collectively received over $200 billion in contracts. This represents 25% of the entire defense budget allocated to just 5 entities. And the established pattern persists. These corporations employ former Pentagon officials. They engage in extensive lobbying of Congress. They strategically position their manufacturing facilities. The F-35 program, managed by Lockheed Martin, relies on suppliers located in 45 states. This is a deliberate strategy. It ensures that 90 senators have constituents employed by the program. To vote against the F-35 is effectively to vote against jobs within their respective states. Consequently, Congress continues to fund it, despite it exceeding its budget sevenfold, despite being years behind schedule, and despite having over 800 documented deficiencies. The operational model initiated by DuPont in 1802 continues to this day. Warfare is lucrative for corporations, their shareholders, their executives, and the politicians who receive campaign contributions and post-retirement employment. The only individuals who do not benefit are the service members who engage in combat, and the taxpayers who bear the financial burden. Now, allow me to present something that should evoke your indignation. Consider the opportunity cost. What could America have accomplished with $485 billion if it had not been allocated to war profiteering? $485 billion could cover the cost of free higher education for every American student for 20 years. It could fund the construction of high-speed rail infrastructure connecting all major metropolitan areas. It could provide universal health care coverage for a decade. It could facilitate the complete renovation of every bridge and roadway in the nation. It could finance cancer research for a century. Instead, it was expended on explosives, fuel, weaponry, and logistical support for military campaigns. Some of these were indeed necessary, but many were not, and while corporations reaped profits, the collective well-being of the nation suffered. This discussion is not about the justification of past conflicts. Some were undoubtedly warranted. World War II was essential. However, even necessary wars were exploited for financial gain. Furthermore, numerous conflicts were encouraged, prolonged, or intensified due to their profitability. The Vietnam War could have concluded years earlier, but defense contractors lobbied for its continuation. The invasion of Iraq was predicated on fabricated intelligence, partially generated by think tanks funded by contractors. Afghanistan evolved into a 20-year occupation, in part because contractors accrued billions by reconstructing what had been destroyed. The pursuit of profit did not initiate these wars, but it certainly extended their duration and inflated their costs beyond what was necessary. Here is the final component of this enduring pattern. The families involved are effectively beyond reproach. Despite evidence of overcharging, fraudulent practices, and excessive profiteering, no individuals face legal repercussions. DuPont underwent an inquiry regarding monopolistic practices in its explosives business during the 1930s. No punitive actions were taken. Standard Oil was dismantled due to monopolistic behavior, yet the Rockefellers retained their wealth, and their companies eventually consolidated once more. Morgan banks were investigated for war profiteering following the First World War. No prosecutions ensued. Halliburton faced scrutiny for overcharging during the Iraq War. They paid a monetary penalty, retained their contracts, and continued to generate profits. Lockheed Martin was investigated for allegedly bribing foreign officials to secure arms sales. They incurred a fine, but the executives involved did not face imprisonment. The pattern remains consistent. Investigations uncover malfeasance. Fines are levied. These fines represent a fraction of the profits obtained. No individuals are subjected to criminal prosecution. The corporations continue their operations unimpeded. This pattern endures because these entities are deemed too vital to prosecute. The military relies on them. Congress depends on them to secure employment opportunities within their constituencies. The broader economy is contingent upon them. Consequently, they are shielded, even when they transgress legal boundaries. 5 families, 5 corporations, spanning 150 years, involved in every major American conflict. And the operational sequence is identical each time. Position themselves before hostilities commence, secure the contracts, inflate the costs, recruit regulatory officials, lobby for further engagement, and profit while others perish. This is not a clandestine plot. It is documented historical reality. The contracts are publicly accessible. The profits are officially recorded. The recurring sequence is undeniable. And it is presently unfolding? The sole remaining question is whether any intervention will occur. Historical precedent suggests it will not, given the immense power of these corporations, the dependence of politicians upon them, and the public's pervasive distraction. If this has altered your perception of military expenditures, if you now comprehend that warfare functions as a business model, then you are beginning to recognize the underlying pattern. 5 families accumulating billions in profits built upon wars that have claimed millions of lives. Subscribe if you wish to gain insight into the actual mechanisms of power, because this information will not be disseminated in educational institutions. You will be taught that these companies are patriotic, that they serve the nation, and that war profiteering is a mere fabrication of conspiracy theorists. However, the contractual agreements are public records, and this pattern has been replicated for 150 years. 5 families implicated in every war, yielding the same outcome. They profit, we incur the cost, and soldiers are the ones who endure the consequences.